Now, just when we thought that the supremacy was buried in the grave, we come to find out that it again resurrected and took on a new approach. In the last commentary, it wore white hoods and it burned crosses. In this commentary, we'll see it attempt to do something completely different. We're studying from the 2005 book White Flight by Dr. Kevin Kruse. Respect. Compared with the leaders of the Colombians and the Klan, Joe Wallace seemed the embodiment of respectability. Joe Wallace lived near Ashby Street, and he was an active member in his community. He also was an active member in the KKK. But as the Klan disintegrated, Wallace branched off from the discredited group and formed his own organization, the West End Cooperative Corporation, a WECC. Remember, the KKK lost its charter, and Grand Dragon Green died, which caused everything to go downhill. So instead of calling it quits, Mr. Wallace took the initiative to create his own organization, the WECC. Though technically outside the Klan, the group adopted the Hooded Order's means and methods, not to mention much of its membership. Although the WECC built upon the legacy of its white supremacist predecessors in a number of ways, it differed from them considerably in one important aspect: its public image, which is the reputation a group or an individual holds in the collective mind. When someone mentions the name of a group, there are feelings, thoughts, or images that are linked to that, which the public in general agrees with. The public image of the KKK at that time was radical and extremist. And the WECC didn't want that reputation, even though they shared a lot in common with them. With their outlandish costumes and crude displays of violence, both the Colombians and the Klan had been ridiculed by Atlanta's moderate establishment as racial extremists who stood outside the circle of respectable life, as rabble-rousers looking for trouble. Back in the 16, 17, and 1800s, what the Klan stood for would have been perfectly acceptable by the general public. But since the times had changed, their approach had fallen outside of the newly defined realm of respectability. And we need to understand that social society fluctuates like a person's mood. One moment a thing is normal, then the next moment it's not. So people have to take into consideration these things when they plan, just like the people here tried to do. The WECC members, in contrast, self-consciously presented themselves as honest homeowners confronted with a social problem not of their making. In so doing, the organization successfully shifted the terms of debate from one that stressed the defense of white supremacy to one that stressed the defense of home, neighborhood, and community. It was still targeting the same outcomes, but it wasn't being blunt and outright about it. It tried to switch up the language, so it still communicated the white supremacy without bluntly saying white supremacy. So it added another layer of protection, where on the surface it appeared like regular working and middle class values without the extremism behind it.
You of the middle class, you with that southern accent, Georgia born and reared, are you going to stand by and lose your birthright without a struggle?
What birthright? The right to dictate where blacks could live? The right to live secluded from Negroes? The right to feel superior to others? And essentially the right to determine the social framework in which all other humans must live within. This is how they were conditioned for many centuries at this point, to genuinely believe that. So to see it slipping through the cracks, this was something worth fighting for. The mounting wave of Negro invasions would ruin the rest of Ashby Street through a drop in property values and the steady spread of decay, he charged. From there, other neighborhoods would follow suit, and then the entire city.
The Negroes will have Atlanta lock, stock, and barrel in less than 10 years if we fail to act.
He warned.
The Negro race will multiply so rapidly, and then we will again, even at the edge of town, be forced to live with them or move farther.
Which were both nearly equally as bad of options for them. To live next to Negroes was a major loss in status in the white community. And obviously living further out meant longer commutes to work. So Wallace understood that they needed to summon the whites to defend. With small groups of 20 or so, Wallace gave a simple pitch.
We don't hate the
he would tell them.
We love him. In his place.
Where's his place? You got the whites at the top and blacks underneath them at the bottom. He's saying as long as they keep things the way they were, we love them as a friend. But as soon as they start doing things to disrupt that pattern, like voting, moving smoothly around the city, getting educated, moving away from the colonially imposed black identity, and so forth, then to that entity, it becomes a problem because those things threaten its power and existence. Unlike earlier groups which had resorted to violence, Wallace promised that the WECC would seek to use capitalism and conversation to solve the problem. Here's how. If whites would purchase homes from blacks and help them
find homes in the Negro district,
he argued they could effectively
remove all Negroes from the West End.
The West End is right here on the map. Now, it did eventually become a predominantly black neighborhood, which was what Wallace and others were hoping to prevent. After that, the neighborhood could be permanently protected by a great white wall of racially restrictive covenants written into the deeds of neighborhood houses. That was a strong game plan, especially if the courts could be relied on to enforce it. And we'll see more on this shortly. But in addition, Wallace also had a game plan to use strategic language to convince blacks to not buy in that area. What he would do is he would have some ladies make phone calls to gather a crowd around the home that a Negro was looking to purchase. Then he would arrive to meet the prospect and act as if he had their best interest in mind. And here's what he would say.
You're too intelligent a Negro to put your family in such a spot. Now, if you'll just leave everything to me, I'll guarantee to either sell your house for what you paid for it, or our corporation will buy it within 15 days.
As Wallace once bragged at a Klan meeting,
99 times out of 100, that ought to do the trick.
So when you couple these soft threats with racially restrictive covenants, then it appears that the problem was solved. At that point, there would be no need to become violent, right? The scheme of balancing a public image of respectability with private threats of violence worked well for the WECC, especially during its first year. But watch this. In May 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, effectively destroying the WECC's only respectable tool of defense. That's how you know reality is against a certain method when it keeps closing the gates. That's what we keep seeing with the white supremacy thing. It served its purpose already. And each time it tries to pop back up and reinforce itself, it eventually gets caged in even harder. This was way back in 1948. And today it's to the point where people who identify as whites, they have to tiptoe around anything that looks like white pride or unity. They can't advertise themselves as having white communities, white banks, white restaurants, or white anything. They have to be extra careful how they use the word white, because all of that has been clamped down by reality. So what we're seeing today can be traced back here to 1948, where the very powerful racial restrictive covenants were deemed unenforceable by the U.S. Supreme Court. With his great white wall suddenly in ruins, Wallace seemed shaken. Publicly, he still promised a diplomatic handling of the housing situation, but without the legal bulwark of racially restrictive covenants, Wallace now only had his hard sell method to protect white neighborhoods in the West End, and by his own admission, that technique required terrorizing his targets. Now it's time to revert back to terrorizing. Remember, that's a tool too. To that end, Wallace and his allies slipped out of the guise of respectability and stepped up their intimidation campaign. One of the people they tried to terrorize was Benny Glenn and his mother, who had just bought a house on Ashby Street. Joe Wallace tried to use his usual threats and to let them know that he wouldn't be responsible for any harm that might happen to them if they moved into that place. And this is what happened. The Glenns refused to budge. Their old home had been condemned as part of an expressway project. They had nowhere else to go. Refusing to be intimidated, they secured a restraining order against Wallace and Harris, arranged for police protection, and then moved in. The Glenns weren't having none of it. Seeing that threats had failed, the WECC decided to abandon negotiations and resort to violence. Here we go. Now, a few months later, another Negro purchased a home on Ashby Street. But this time, things went a bit different.
Mr. Wallace asked me, was I the owner of the house? I said yes. Then he questioned me about my moving in. He said that it wasn't advisable for me to do so because they were going to bomb it. Then the other white man said that if I moved in, I would be running my own funeral.
Was he bluffing? Let's find out. The house exploded that night. This is some wild stuff. With a deafening blast heard a mile away, several sticks of dynamite blew out the windows, crumbled the plaster walls, and shot a wooden plank 50 feet down the street and through a neighbor's window. The WECC was apparently no longer content to make empty threats. There were some brave folks back then. I might have had to think twice before moving on Ashby Street. In spite of its turn to violence, the WECC still tried to project an air of respectability. One way of doing that was through the West End Eagle newspaper, where it said this:
"The Eagle will stand for the rights of Southern people. Through the columns of this newspaper, we will show you how. Big slogans, racial equality, civic improvement, and other self-righteous, pious, high-sounding, overworked words have become a tool of exploitation in the mouths of a handful of unscrupulous individuals and organizations, working for their own gain of political, monetary, or personal power."
But was he lying? That's the question. Were they using those as tools to get political power and profits? Wasn't that the motive behind the coalition, like we discussed previously? Now, obviously, Joe Wallace's motive was very different from that of the white coalition and the white moderates. And they made sure to greatly influence his public image. And here's what he said about it.
I have been called a rabble-rouser and blamed for the delivery of fiery speeches. If a Negro family moved into your block as your neighbor, would you need anybody to rabble-rouse to start you on the warpath? Would you need fiery speeches? No. You would have more need for a pacifier, a diplomat, to cool you down and help you to work out a plan, using the law rather than violence to make a peaceful settlement. That is exactly what I had to do.
And from his view, he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. But his method was outdated. Although Wallace tried to portray himself and his organization as respectable, the damage to the image of both had already been done. In its early years, the WECC had succeeded where the Colombians and Klan had failed, largely because it managed to disguise the rabidity of racial violence with the respectability of community politics. Rather than project an air of lawlessness and violence, WECC members presented themselves as hard-working, honest homeowners concerned about their families, their homes, their neighborhoods, and their city. Their motivation was not racism, they insisted, but their rights. But as soon as the organization resorted to outright violence, it ceded all claims to respectability and steadily lost its appeal. Within a few years, Joe Wallace had no credibility and no following, caged off, just like we talked about earlier. But other segregationist groups in Atlanta looked to the WECC example. They realized that success lay in respectability and a reasonable appeal to middle-class values, while violence and open bigotry would only lead to failure. So his group functioned like a prototype to show others what worked and what didn't work. The Colombians, the KKK, and the WECC all failed because they used violence and overt methods that were outdated and backwards. But afterwards, the supremacy would learn to adapt. And we're going to learn about that in the next commentary. I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.